The so-called special operation in Ukraine is clearly not going according to Russia's plan. Putin thought that it would end quickly and without any setbacks, and that Ukraine would fall in a matter of weeks. However, in the first months, Ukraine showed that it was capable of resisting and fighting back. And a month ago it became clear that Ukraine has every opportunity to reclaim its lands. The longer the conflict continues, the weaker the Kremlin's position becomes. In this video, we will discuss what mistakes Putin has made while carrying out this special operation. The first and most important mistake that many rulers have made is underestimating their adversary. As we mentioned earlier, the Kremlin hoped that the operation in Ukraine would be over in just a few weeks or months, like the American operation in Iraq. In fact, even Western politicians at first wrote Ukraine off. The failure to properly assess the enemy was caused by Putin's own subjective perception that Ukraine is not an actual country and that the Ukrainians themselves are just Russians that are not going to fight back. In his speeches, Putin has stated that Ukraine was artificially made by Lenin and has no basis for further existence. This preconceived notion was the basis for the start of the special operation. In 1991, Ukraine broke off and became independent, but not because of national riots, as was the case with many other European countries, but primarily because the Soviet Union collapsed from within. In many ways, this dismissive attitude gave Putin the impression that Ukraine would not be able to stand up to him. Moreover, Russia believed that there would be no significant resistance. This was far from reality, though, as shown by surveys before the military conflict, the Ukrainians' attitude, and the strengthening of their army. But Russia was not particularly interested in real data, and was largely guided by personal feelings about the weakness of Ukrainian society. The second reason is a lot of blunders in military and its tactics. In addition to the fact that the Russian command underestimated the Ukrainian resistance, the larger issue was that it initially had no real strategy whatsoever, and even several months into the conflict it is still making a lot of mistakes. As for the first weeks of the conflict, the main problem was that Russia simply rushed its troops to storm the cities, without proper preparation or supplies. Again, the command assumed that there would be no significant resistance. And so, these mindless tactics resulted in major losses in personnel and equipment in the first few months. The convoys of military assets that were moving towards Kiev simply stopped due to the fuel shortage, and became easy targets for both combat drones and infantry with javelins. A lot of vehicles were hijacked. In general, supply problems still haunt the Russian army. While the main Russian troops were standing in long columns towards Kiev without the ability to move, the Russian military decided to drop their assault troops near Kiev, which were crushed without support from the rear. By and large, the first weeks of the conflict were characterized by a complete lack of tactics. The Russian command assumed that entering the cities would be straightforward, and most of the battles would be fought with guerrilla troops. Later, the course of the special operation was slightly altered. Russia realized that it would not be able to take the cities so easily, and switched to artillery duels. Overall, this tactic had its benefits. The Russian army was able to fully occupy the Luhansk region. However, this strategy also had negative side effects. The Russian military took many major cities directly, which depleted the army of its most combat-ready units. The supply problems still weren't resolved, and the Russian army continued to store shells and equipment in mass quantities, making them easy targets for the HIMARS. The recent Ukrainian offensive near Kharkiv also revealed many problems in the Russian army's defense. Turns out Russia was not preparing to defend the occupied territories at all. Military units were not even surrounded by trenches. Moreover, unexperienced, recently mobilized soldiers and paramilitary units of the Russian army were ordered to defend key positions. A lack of cohesion of various units of the Russian army does not allow it to perform active maneuvers on the battlefield. For example, the Military Air Force Command has almost no communication with ground forces. The army is centralized based on the Soviet model. Western experts have noted that in this regard the Ukrainian army has been more effective due to the grassroots activism and the ability to make decisions in the field. Cyber attacks by the Russian side were also unsuccessful. Ukraine was able to repel them effectively, not without the help of Western countries, of course. In general, the Russian command made a lot of military mistakes in the course of this campaign. The third reason is the opening of the front in many directions and sparse numbers. The beginning of the armed conflict was marked by Russian troops simultaneously advancing from 6 or 7 directions, from Crimea, LPR, DPR, Kharkov towards the Sumy Oblast, Chernigov, and of course Kiev. This prevented Russia from concentrating its forces in one direction and dealing a devastating blow to the Ukrainian army. In fact, the only successful direction was an attack from Crimea, thanks to which the city of Mariupol was surrounded and Kherson was captured. Basically, Russian troops were spread too thin. In the first months, other lines of defense were not broken through, some units even had to retreat, while other areas saw long periods of resistance with a slow push through the defenses. This problem is compounded by the fact that, according to various sources, Russia deployed between 150,000 and 200,000 soldiers, which is extremely low for the occupation of a country of 40 million inhabitants. Western experts believed that an effective strike required an army of about 1 million soldiers, which Russia simply did not have at the time of the attack. Moreover, given the number of military personnel, there would have been only 4 soldiers per 1,000 people. This would not be enough to maintain order in the territories. After World War II, for example, there were approximately 101 soldiers per 1,000 people in the American-occupied part of Germany. But in Iraq, the proportion was 7 to 1,000, which caused problems for the Americans. To put it simply, it's not nearly enough to occupy a country of this size, or even to maintain the occupation in it. The fourth reason is Shoigu and corruption. Although this is rather the result of the current system than a mistake that could have been avoided. Anyway, as the military campaign began, it became clear that the West largely overestimated the Russian army, believing that it was capable of dealing more damage. When evaluating the Russian army on paper, Western countries assumed that it was actually comparable to the largest armies in the world. Moreover, about $60 billion a year were spent on its upkeep, and Russia was always among the top military spenders. Year after year, Russia has been showcasing its military innovations and maintaining substantial military exports. However, as the special operation began, the problems reared their ugly heads. These include obsolete equipment dating from Soviet times, insufficient military supplies, soldiers had problems with equipment and even provisions, and a shortage of drones, which in recent years have become crucial on the battlefield. The Russian army still does not have enough drones. Russia is not producing enough of them and has to buy them from Iran. Many of the latest Russian vehicles are virtually non-existent at the front lines. They exist either as prototypes or produced as one-offs. Russia is still using T-72s made in the Soviet Union as their main tanks. By and large, the problems in the Russian army were caused primarily due to poor competence of the Russian command, and in addition, due to total corruption, which led to the lack of basic necessities for the soldiers. The fifth reason is unreadiness for a full-scale war. Despite the talk that NATO countries were advancing toward Russia's borders and that they were about to attack Russia, it became clear that the Russian commanders did not see this as a real threat and were not preparing for a full-scale war of any kind. This is mainly reflected in the Russian economy, which was completely unprepared to deal with the consequences. Unlike in Soviet Union, the Russian industry is not designed for mass production of military equipment. Russia relied on existing stockpiles of equipment too much. Last but not least, the entire modern industry is dependent on Western import, particularly microchips, which, because of sanctions, will also be extremely difficult to acquire, posing yet another challenge for the Russians. Overall, despite its blatant militarism, the Russian economy was not ready for war. In conclusion, Russia made many mistakes in this special operation, from underestimating the enemy and failing to prepare its economy, to the lack of a coherent army and multiple blunders on the battlefield. This video was made possible thanks to our sponsors on Patreon, Boosty, and YouTube. If you like our content, please consider supporting us.